So first, I'd just like to say welcome. Thank you all for joining us, and especially thank you to our speakers, Anne and Jenice. Just a couple quick housekeeping. If you could keep your mic muted if you are not talking, it just helps prevent feedback, and we don't want to interrupt our speakers. Feel free to put any questions that you might have in the chat, or you are also welcome to unmute yourself and ask away. We're going to start with Jenice's presentation and then followed by Anne's, and we'll save time for questions as well. And then Jenice, if you would like to go ahead and get started.
Okay, hi everybody, thank you for joining. I'm Jenice Dames. I'm presenting from Texas where it was 80 degrees today. So I'm happy to be here with you. I was going to cover the topic of learning styles and unique learners. My background is special education. And so this is kind of a passion of mine to talk about learning styles. I think we don't talk about it enough. But feel free to stop me and ask questions. If you have questions, I'd be happy to answer any questions, and I might be asking a couple questions of y'all. So I know there's a lot of conversation about what type of learning styles individuals have, and we usually get the common ones. Oh, I'm an auditory, I'm a visual learner, I'm a kinesthetic learner. Those are typically the three learning styles that most people think of when we talk about learning styles. But I'm not sure if y'all know that there's 8 different learning styles. Was anybody aware of that there are 8?
I know I wasn't.
Pardon?
I know I was not.
Okay, well that's good. Okay, that I'm glad to hear that, that this is going to be some new information. And so as I go through them, it's going to be interesting because most people, if I talk about these, are like, oh my gosh, I know someone who is that learning style, or oh my gosh, that's me. I identify with that learning style. So the first one is a logical or mathematical learner. That doesn't mean you're really good at math. It could mean you're good at math. But let me give you an example of a logical learner or a mathematical learner. They typically need to ask a million questions to get everything kind of straight and everything kind of makes sense for them to kind of understand or wrap their heads around a certain topic. An example I always give is, this is totally my son. We're going to the dentist. When are we going? Are you picking me up from school? Do we get to get ice cream afterwards? Do I have to get a shot? Or they, you know, there's like a million questions that come with it, but it's just that way of processing. They're typically good at math, maybe engineering, maybe puzzles, maybe different things like that, but it's usually those learners that really want to make sure things fit somewhere in their thinking. I'm not sure if you're already thinking of someone or if you're like, oh my gosh, that's me. The second one is verbal or linguistic. Typically, it's not just through speaking. A verbal or linguistic learner learns through reading, through poetry, through language, interacting, talking with others. You could probably say I'm a verbal or a linguistic learner. I love talking and listening and interacting with others. They like to maybe hear certain things and then go read it or follow up on their notes. That may be a way to help that type of learner. I'm not sure if that describes you. The third one is a visual or spatial learner. This is not me. So visual spatial learners kind of have the global approach. They can see, for example, like the city. Oh, that's in this side of the city and you can get there if you go this way. And oh, that's north or outside the loop. This is just one example. Where I'm like, just tell me at the stop sign, do I go right or left? Do I take a left at the food, at the fast food restaurant, or do I take a right, or do I keep going? So my spatial is not my strength, or can see things, kind of see a picture and replicate it or remember everything that they saw. Some visual learners will highlight maybe their notes from school in different colors, and then when they go take a test, they're like, oh, that was highlighted in purple, oh, that was highlighted in yellow, because they've kind of got that visual and that spatial reasoning. The fourth one is kinesthetic, which I think we've all heard. Learn through movement. All children, 8 till about 6, 7, or 8, are kinesthetic learners by nature, just through developmental. milestones, so that's very typical. But some individuals are kinesthetic learners through life. It's like if I can be walking or talking or moving something on my body or connecting something as I move, that's how I'm going to learn the information. I know when I was a teacher in the classroom, if I had a kinesthetic learner, we would play basketball or something while we would do math facts or something like that, because that would help the information stick. Rhythmic or musical. So these are learners where, and this one was really hard for me, where sometimes you have an individual who's got like music blaring in the background while they're studying, and you're like, how are you going to learn or retain any information? But it works for them. There's kind of, it ignites, or they tap into a certain aspect of their brain where that's really what kind of helps root the information for them. I'm going to do the next two together, interpersonal and intrapersonal. So interpersonal is I learn better when I'm in a very individualized or intimate setting with somebody else. This is where, you may be in a classroom setting or with your professor, and you hear this big, long, lecture or speech, and you understand it, but then you want to go up to somebody and go, now, is this what was said? Is this how you understood it? What did this mean to you? Where I'm going to have a conversation with just one or two people to help kind of cement that information. And that's where they learn best. So when I was in the classroom, I would always get those one or two students who would always want to, or when I was a professor, that would always come up to me after directions were given or assignment was given. It's like, now this is what you said, correct? Because that's the way that they were kind of remembering it or anchoring the information. And intrapersonal is completely myself. That might be a learner where you're talking and you're like, are they listening? Are they understanding what I'm saying? But they're taking everything in, and then they go think about it, and then they're like, oh, now I remember everything. It's just kind of a very individualized learning style. And then the last one is naturalist, and I think we overlook this one. First of all, there's overwhelming research that shows that when we're connected to nature, we learn better. But there is a lot of research that also shows that individuals that are in a rehabilitation situation, if they have access to outdoors or even viewing outdoors, they heal quicker. Individuals in public housing, if they have an open door to a courtyard, they're more inclined to get out of public housing sooner. I mean, there's overwhelming research about what nature can do for us. And sometimes just being in nature can help individuals relax certain aspects of their brain, and therefore kind of learn and anchor the information that they have. So my question for y'all is, does anybody know what learning style you are?
I don't, but after listening to all that, I feel like I might be a combination of a few.
Okay. Does anybody else know?
Emily said she feels she's a combination of a few too.
Right. And you can be a combination. In some situations, you're like, oh, this is how I learn. But in other situations, this is how I learn best.
Yep. And then Grace also said she feels like she's logical. And Emily agreed. She said, yeah, it depends on with context.
Right. Which is very typical. But I always ask people, don't you wish you knew growing up what learning style you were?
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, that kind of would help me, because as I started learning more about learning styles, and I've been kind of doing a lot of research on them for years now, it's really helped me where I know, oh, this situation I'm not going to do well. I'm not going to do well when information's just kind of given at me, or it's given to me visually. I know that's not going to work for me. So I've got to make sure I put it into a learning style where I'm comfortable, so that I know that I can remember it or do what I need to do with the information. So it's just very interesting to kind of know where you are, and even as adults, kind of learning where you are. Any questions about that?
Emily actually asked, do learning styles change, or does someone stay with one style for life?
That's a great question. They can change, because like I said, most learners are kinesthetic, most children are kinesthetic, and then they kind of grow out of it, which I hate to even use the term grow out of it, but some learn what works better for them. I think they can change, and I don't want to say they're going to change because all of a sudden that learning style doesn't work for me and this one does. I think they change because we've learned what works better for us as we get older. And so that's why even when I present and talk to teachers in the classroom of young children. I'm like, start figuring it out and helping, tell the parents, hey, every time I have music on, your child seems to retain the information. Your child asks me a lot of questions, which is awesome. They may be a logical learner. You may want to try this as they get older. Just because I think the earlier we can kind of start planting those seeds, the more successful we might help them become as they're going through and they're learning. My other work and my other passion is talking to teachers about not just teaching to one learning style. So I always challenge teachers. I'm like, if you're going to present information, give it in a variety of learning styles. Don't just think you're going to talk and they're all going to listen. That's just a very old school way of thinking. I really want everyone to think about, even if you're teaching or you're working with somebody, respect and kind of understand that they may not learn or think the way that you do. So I think that's really important to me. Is there another question? Do you have any more questions, I should say?
Doesn't look like we do yet. If we do, I'll let you know.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure. So now we can talk about kind of some unique learners. So there are some times where we can really have an idea of what type of learner some individuals might be. So I've listed a few of them. And I also want you to kind of take notice of the picture that I put here, because this is what we're seeing more and more in classrooms. And I think even as adults, we're kind of seeing more and more that like Google, like their work environment has more, where they're kind of catering more towards learning styles. And I'm starting to see this translated in the classroom, which makes my heart very happy. Where there's flexible seating and students kind of learning on the floor, or, sitting in a lounge chair, or sitting up at a tall desk, or I've seen dining room tables in classrooms now, bean bags, different ways for kids to kind of interact with how they learn, if they want to stand, different things, if they need to write it on the board instead of just kind of writing it on paper. So it makes me really happy to kind of see that we're starting to get the message younger and younger. But let's talk about some of the individual learning styles, like individuals with autism. So my background is special education. It's a big passion of mine. So we can typically say that individuals with autism are visual learners. That doesn't mean there are not other types of learners, but there is overwhelming research that shows that individuals with autism learn best when things are presented visually. So we try to make their word visual. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of Temple Grandin. She's a huge advocate and speaker, and an individual herself that has autism, and she has her PhD. She really does a good job of kind of explaining why that individuals with autism see movies. There's constantly visual pictures in their mind, so kind of making their word visual. ADD, it used to be called ADHD or ADD now. The DSM-5, which is the Book of Diagnosis, has changed it to just ADD, Attention Deficit Disorder, type 1 or type 2. Individuals with autism, ADD, are typically kinesthetic learners because they're moving, and naturalists. So there's overwhelming research that shows that individuals with ADD, the signs and symptoms of ADD, if you will, decrease when you're in nature. So when I was a teacher in the classroom and I would kind of get some individuals that I was kind of noticing, I would take the entire class outside. Let's go write our math problems in chalk on the ground. Let's go read our book under a tree. And you can just kind of see that it kind of calms and lessens some of those effects. So they might have other learning styles as well, but we can usually kind of count on naturalist or kinesthetic learners. Questions so far? I thought I saw a question pop up. No? Or Rochelle, just feel free to stop me if there is a question.
You're fine. Grace just said that most of her daughter's school utilizes flexible seating.
Oh, I'm so happy to hear that. We've come a long way just since I've been kind of on this bandwagon, and it's not just me doing it, but there's just so much research that we're really getting on board with some flexible seating and kind of getting away from sitting in a desk all day. First of all, the desks are uncomfortable. I don't know if anyone's tried to sit in a school desk all day. It's not comfortable. So I'm happy to hear that. I am really happy to hear that. Dyslexia, or individuals with dyslexia. This one can vary because it used to be tied to, we used to give them color overlays and they just need to visually see it differently. But now research is kind of showing that the visual aspect is not always going to be a strength for individuals with dyslexia. Typically, it's going to be some more auditory, maybe some logical, not all of them, but that's kind of a way to approach it, an individual with dyslexia, because sometimes the written word, or even sometimes the spoken word, if there's some phonological processing, which is a whole other thing, may kind of impede some of the learning style. So I work a lot with individuals with visual impairment and individuals who are deaf or hard of hearing. So obviously a visual impairment, an individual with a visual impairment is not a visual learner, obviously. So auditory, they're typically auditory learners and kinesthetic learners. And then our deaf hard of hearing is, it needs to be visual, but I want to point out too, for deaf hard of hearing, there's typically, for both of these, we call them VI and DHH, visual impairment and deaf hard of hearing, typically both of those need interpersonal learning as well. There's something called incidental learning that individuals and children learn in their environment. They see something, they learn from it. They hear something, they learn from it. We call that incidental learning. The incidental learning is not present for individuals with visual impairment or deaf hard of hearing. So typically there needs to be some interpersonal, someone giving them, interpersonal. Someone needs to be giving them some information on a personal level for them to kind of understand some of the other learning. So the interpersonal is very important for the VI and the DHH. Any questions about that?
Yes, Christina said she would love to know more about how librarians can support children with dyslexia.
Mm-hmm.
She said she's recommended Hoopla and other downloadable audiobooks, but are there other services?
There's research is just now kind of, it's a hot topic right now, dyslexia, because we're starting to finally learn more about it. And so all of those services are great and books on tape are great, but we are finding that there's a population of individuals with dyslexia that have phonological processing. So sometimes hearing those, so there needs to be kind of a lot of repetition and really understanding the type of dyslexia that they have. So as far as individual services, it's really hard to say, but I'm gonna hope that their school or the person that's kind of done some of the testing to find out how the dyslexia is affecting them, that they might be able to recommend something or go in the right direction with that. I don't know if that answered that great, but it's kind of, there's a lot coming out right now. I mean, stay tuned for dyslexia. There's a lot coming out.
All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm. So are there any other types of unique learners that anybody can think of? I just tried to put some of the probably most common ones that y'all might encounter. Okay, so this is my contact information, and I finished 20 minutes. This is my contact information. I'd love to hear from anybody if you have more questions. That's how you email me, and phone number, please feel free to reach out. And of course, Rochelle has my information. But are there any closing questions about that?
No, doesn't look like it. I'll have
Okay.
some for both of you at the end.
Okay.
And for everybody, if you don't have time to take down Jenice's information or aren't in a place where you can, this will also be posted on our blog.
Okay, thank you so much for letting me talk to you about something I love.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
And then Anne, if you would like to, stop sharing Jenice's screen here.
Oh, do you need me to do that? Okay.
You're good, I got it. And if you want to go ahead and start yours.
All right, is that looking good for everybody?
Yep, looks good.
Yes, okay, great. So, bonjour everyone, hello. Ann Heidemann Indishnikas, Saginaw Chippewa Akin and Donjaba. My name is Ann Heidemann and I serve as the Tribal Librarian for the Saginaw Chippewa Indian Tribe. I want to acknowledge that I am a settler, white, and Anishinaabe is not my language, but I'm striving to learn and practice as much as I can because by mission, the culture and language are incorporated into all the Tribal Library services. I do have a bunch of slides and I tend to talk pretty quickly. I definitely have left time for questions at the end though, so please feel free to be thinking about those. So talking about systemic injustice sounds kind of terrible, but it is going to be fine. I'm really happy to be here today to talk with you about it. I also want to say up front that I'm coming at this from a perspective of a white person, and I do recognize that I am complicit in white supremacy. I'm trying to do this anti-racist work while staying in my lane, speaking primarily to other white folks, which is the majority in librarianship. So when I say we, that is what I mean. And even if, or especially if we're good people who mean well and we don't consider ourselves racist, I think that we still have to take responsibility for making change. So that said, this is not about me or us or anyone's journey of personal growth. We can't center whiteness and still be doing this work. I also want to tell you that nothing I'm going to tell you is a brilliant idea I came up with all by myself. I've learned all of it from experts that I look to, and I've cited them on a source list, and I will have a link at the end. And the overarching theme of my understanding of all of this stuff is that we need to, as Dr. Kim Tallbear puts it, be in good relation with one another. In addition to with one another, with the world around us, and with the systems that we're part of, with everything. So I'll be asking today, how can we think critically to see where we might not be in good relation, and what can we do to improve? So what experiences might have shaped our ideas about race, culture, gender, and power? And how do those experiences play out in our actions? Indigenous, Black, and people of color have to know white reality in a way that white people are never expected to understand anyone else's reality, and even, or especially, our own. White supremacy relies on our ignorance. And a lot of us might have been raised with an attitude of, work hard, do your best, everything will work out for you. Like, that's the American dream, right? But that assumes that there's a level playing field that we're all starting from, and that everyone is just judged solely on merit, but we know that that's not true. So if you are like me, you may have been socialized to, and maybe by nature, have a desire to know the correct answer. But I don't think that any of this is as simple as that. And sometimes we might get called out when we make a mistake. I think we have to be able to recognize when we have an opportunity to learn and not take it as a personal attack. Dr. Adrienne Keene terms this consenting to learn in public. Being able to receive critique as a gesture of respect and an act of kindness is the key, I think, to freeing ourselves from the fear of saying or doing the wrong thing. So when we talk about racism, misogyny, anti-LGBTQAI, ableism, classism, sizeism, and heteronormativity, we have to recognize that these systems are all connected and overlap. A lot of things that we take for granted are not actually true. As library workers, I think we're probably inclined to research and learn things, and I think that we should go with that and apply it across the board. And we might think of white supremacy as being capital E evil, but I think it's more than that, and it can look many different ways. And a lot of those things are things that we see on a daily basis. So just like a majority of things on this iceberg, a lot of objectionable things are socially acceptable in a lot of places. I don't think that means that we can't make different choices, including what we consider to be tolerable or acceptable. So do we see ourselves, our libraries, or our communities anywhere on here? Settler colonialism is just at the root of so much of American societal injustice. And when I talk about settler colonialism, I'm talking about the system on which the United States was founded and which is still thriving today, which functions through the replacement of an indigenous populations with an invasive settler society that over time develops a distinctive identity and sovereignty. We white people came in and stole and killed. We learn about manifest destiny in school, often without much thought to how messed up the concept is. And this country was also built on the foundation of enslaving people. As you can see on this visual, most of the signers of the Declaration of Independence did so. I think we have to recognize that anti-Blackness is built into our society and structures. So we need to let go of and reject the mindset and tools of oppression, which also necessitates making restitution and reparations. And that includes handing over control of decision-making. I'm talking about systemic changes that will, by their nature, hopefully, transform how our organizations operate. And I've had some folks say to me, well, I want to make restitution, so I'm going to try and be more indigenous, or take on aspects of a culture that settler colonialism tried to obliterate. But I do not think that is a good idea. I think we need to be our white selves while improving what that means by fixing those systems. So here's where I think that we can start. And we hear a lot about being an ally, and I wonder, what if we go beyond that and try to be an accomplice? I think in order to be an accomplice, we need to actively support the struggle, stand up even when we feel scared, transfer the benefits of our privilege to those who have less, and acknowledge that the conversation is not about us. And we also need to recognize that this is ongoing work that will never be finished. So though I'm always a person who wants to solve the big problem, I recognize that the way we get there includes a lot of small changes, and there's plenty of room for that in how we operate our libraries. Collection development is a form of gatekeeping. We make choices about what we purchase, what we replace, and what we keep. Buying a book is a political act, and so is selecting a book for the library, and so is promoting or using a book in a program. I think we wield power in our purchasing, both in terms of what we buy and where we buy it. If we know that a publisher is taking real action to publish Indigenous, Black, and people of color and carefully vets its projects to make sure that representation is authentic, let's put our money there instead of with a publisher that's just maintaining the status quo. So when we're selecting books to purchase, how do we decide? I learned that there are a handful of library industry journals that we can trust for reviews. They're published by known long-time industry companies and organizations, and the reviewers are experts in literature and librarianship. But who are those reviewers? A lot of librarians, a group of people with a fairly narrow range of experience. And I now look to see who wrote a review. And I look for reviews by someone who can speak to the experience of the person or people that a book is about. And I also look to other sources for reviews, including blogs and people on Twitter. These experts often share information and perspectives that I just am not seeing in those traditional journals. And I try to further develop my own ability to evaluate content critically. I ask, who wrote this? And what gives them the permission to tell this story? Even when it comes to someone who is writing about their own experience, I think we still have to look deeper. People who are marginalized are not immune to the world that we live in and can also have racist views or unconscious bias. One Indigenous writer can appropriate another Native nation's culture. And it might also be true that someone writes authentically about their marginalized experience, but they also happen to be a misogynist or an abuser or something else reprehensible. And I think, for me anyway, I can't not take that into consideration when I'm choosing books to purchase and promote in the library. And that leads to an often asked question, which is, can we separate the artist from the art? And this is something that I struggled with for years, but I've come around to feeling like it's a hard no for me. I asked myself, how great would a book have to be to make someone's abuse worth it? And so if we're doing our jobs, we regularly and consistently weed books from our collections. Weeding a book might mean recycling it, or in some cases, just throwing it away. Someone might say that's censorship, and we've probably all heard about situations where someone got upset when they heard that libraries don't keep all books forever. But as we know, it's okay for us to weed a book and to say that we do not recommend something. We talk a lot about intellectual freedom, and it's very important, obviously, but I don't think that we are professionally obligated to respect views that are steeped in hate. Just as we reject the white supremacy of #AllLivesMatter, we must also reject #AllIdeasMatter. For much of my career, I heard people speak about libraries as though they are neutral, as though that was a given. But I think that anything that's created by a person or people can never be neutral. Every policy, every decision, unless we can identify the way in which a thing is actively fighting against oppression, then it's almost certainly holding it up. I'm sure that you all recognize the medal that's on this book cover, and seeing that Newbery Medal or the Caldecott Medal or any other award on a book cover has, I think, to many people, often meant that they were guaranteed to get a quality book. But I wonder if it does. I think that what those medals really tell us is that the book was recognized by the people who served on that committee in the year that it was published, with all the limitations of those individuals at that time. Most people who serve on the major award committees are librarians, so we can guess what they might have in common, mostly middle-class white ladies. I was lucky enough to serve on the Caldecott, and it was 100% white women on the committee. So any group that homogenous is going to have limits to their experience, and those limits will inform their thinking. I also just want to point out that the character who says this is described as living in a home littered with debris, everything you would normally find in a garbage can. And I think that type of vilification of like those types of white people makes it really easy for the white reader to distance themselves from racism. And it also reinforces an incorrect analysis of what racism is. And when we look at histories, we need to remember whose perspective is being told from. The majority of mainstream publishing, including nonfiction, centers whiteness and that settler colonialist perspective. So this is the house that George built, except is it? Who actually did the labor of building that house? People who were enslaved by George. Virtually every book that you'll read about westward expansion will describe the native people who were already living there as obstacles that the brave white settlers had to overcome. And these depictions just leave no room for the humanity of anyone who isn't white. The Confederate flag is classified by the Anti-Defamation League as a hate symbol. If we promote books that display that flag positively, what are we telling our patrons? And if you're all familiar with the atrocities that Robert E. Lee committed, the fact that these books portray him as a great and brave leader sends a clear message. The Jim Crow system was built on a foundation of propaganda that celebrated lies about what Lee and his fellows stood for. So are we promoting books that perpetuate those lies? And I think if we say that someone's actions are acceptable because they're a product of their time, we're ignoring the damage those actions did to other people. Saying in essence that killing and enslaving other human beings was okay because it was a long time ago. So it can feel not good to acknowledge that a book has racist content when you can remember your love for that book. I think we need to be able to separate our experience of reading or being read to from a book that we now recognize as problematic. We can still remember our experiences fondly without needing to hang on to that particular book. And if we do find problematic content in a favorite, we need to learn to hold a couple of ideas at the same time. 1, a book was influential in making me the person I am. 2, that book is racist or misogynist or whatever. And 3, this means that I as a person was shaped by those racist or misogynist ideas. And then we have to interrogate how this might have affected our views and actions. So if you do an analysis, as the footnote here did, of a classic, virtually universally beloved writer of children's books like Dr. Seuss, you will see that 98% of the characters in his books are white. White characters narrate the stories and have all the speaking roles. White characters are always in a dominant role in relation to characters of color. There are 0 representations of women or girls of color, and all relationships are heteronormative. Theodore Geisel, aka Dr. Seuss, was also known for his anti-Black and anti-Semitic political cartoons, advertisements, and propaganda for the US government. So knowing all of this makes it pretty impossible for me to recommend his books. Is the concept of sovereignty willfully ignored? Many books refer to Native Americans as the first Americans, but we know that Native nations predate what was later named America. Do we purchase or accept donations of materials that are anti-immigration or anti-science? If we put an anti-vaccine movie on our shelf next to those about actual science, what does that tell our community? So the way we describe books in our systems is also important. Metadata can be racist. Our library systems assume that a straight, white, cisgender, Christian, able American male is the default. So how can we change that false assumption with our own practices? You might ask yourself where you'd look on the shelf to find a creation story in a public library. If it's a Judeo-Christian creation story, you go to religion, right? The 200s, if you're using Dewey. But if it's a creation story from a Native nation, where would you find it? In the 398s, with folklore and myths, and with fairy tales. So if a creation story from your culture is shelved next to Rumpelstiltskin, what does that say about how the library views you? Many Native nations are described using official Library of Congress subject headings that are settler-imposed names. Why would we call someone by a name if they wouldn't call it themselves? We are actually just starting a 3-year IMLS National Leadership Grant funded project to decolonize and indigenize our systems of organization here at the tribal libraries where I work. That is a whole nother presentation, but I would love to talk more about it to anyone who is interested. When we plan story times or other programs, do we always plan by theme? Do we also consider other things about the books we're using? Do we look at the programs we've planned over the course of a year or season and know who is represented, how much and how well? Are we talking out loud about our anti-racist work? What does our library staff photo look like? When we hire program presenters or other contractors, does that change how it looks? Simply hiring someone who is a member of a marginalized group is not going to fix the white supremacist practices of our organizations. In fact, hiring one Indigenous, Black, or person of color amongst an all or mostly white staff and expecting things to change just based on that person's presence is not only unrealistic and disrespectful, it essentially sabotages that person's chances at success. So we must find ways to make sure that our libraries are spaces where Indigenous, Black, and people of color are invited, supported, and empowered to be their whole selves, safely and comfortably. And we need to build in additional scaffolding so that people from underrepresented backgrounds in libraries can imagine a future for themselves, where there's mentorship and a promotion path is clear. So there are a lot of benefits to less homogeneous teams. Studies show that simply by being in the presence of someone who is different, we are more diligent and open-minded. We work harder on explaining our rationale and anticipating alternatives than we would have otherwise. Diverse groups perform better than homogeneous groups, but we need to be aware of the fact that they also have more conflict and enjoy working together less. And we all know how library folks feel about conflict, right? So this means that as we build a more diverse library staff, we also need to build our skills on giving and receiving feedback and communicating when there is conflict. We need to learn how to recognize when criticism is respectful, how to speak directly when we disagree, and how to work together when we need to improve. When we're looking to build our staff, what are we bringing to the table? Do we have full-time positions for entry-level workers? Do we pay a living wage? Do we offer benefits to all employees, and does our insurance really cover everyone? Do we allow for staff at all levels to explore reskilling and shifting responsibilities? Are staff at all levels involved in decision-making? Do we demonstrate a willingness to name racism and address conflict? Is anti-racism part of our mission and values? If our library or staff participates in local groups like Rotary or Kiwanis, does it also participate in Black Lives Matter and other anti-oppression groups? And when we're hiring, we need to remember that cultural fit is a way of perpetuating sameness. If we hire for fit, we're hiring people who are like us, and nothing is going to change. Does our dress code fit with our community's expectations, or is it more informed by dominant society's ideas of what is professional? Does our dress code reinforce white cishet expectations? Is it sizist? Does it specify limits on hairstyles in ways that might be culturally or racially specific? Does it include requirements for clothing based on gender? Does our code of conduct include regulations about a patron's dress? And what are we hoping to accomplish with these regulations? How do we view people when they walk into our libraries? Do we have assumptions about what makes the ideal library patron? What assumptions are we making about someone's background, culture, and language? We're taught our whole lives to look at someone and make assessments based on their appearance or how they speak or any other number of things that we can perceive about them. A lot of these things we do without even thinking about it. And in libraries, I think we learn at public service desks to make assessments in terms of what the patron might need. And that can easily lead us to enact our unconscious bias. As long as we hold up the norms of the dominant social group in America as the standard to which everyone should aspire in order to be considered adequate, we perpetuate a system that rewards white attitudes and behaviors and renders all others inferior, broken, and inadequate. We need to make sure that we are not attempting to train library patrons into an embodiment of whiteness. People tell us all kinds of things all day, every day, including complaints, compliments, comments, and maybe things that we don't need to hear. I think anybody who's worked at a public service desk has had a TMI moment. But are we listening for signs of structural oppression enacted by the library? I think it's also really easy for us to get used to hearing the same old complaints and kind of file them away as the usual. And it can be really easy to put a patron in a box labeled high maintenance. I think the less we have in common personally with a patron, the more likely we are to dismiss them and their needs. So any barrier that we put between a person and a service will, because of systemic oppression, disproportionately hurt those who are already marginalized. What does someone have to do to get a library card? What if they don't have a permanent address or a photo ID? Do we require advanced sign up for programs? Do we require them to show a library card? How about to use the computers or to print? And asking ourselves, are those restrictions really necessary? Do we collect any information that we don't use? Like, do we ask for patrons to identify their gender on our library card applications? And why are we asking? What are we using that information for? I think if there's a possibility that a piece of data will not be useful, we shouldn't collect it. Everything that we ask patrons to share with us should be for a reason. And if we do ask for patrons to identify their gender identity, is it in order to use their pronouns? And maybe we could just ask what their pronouns are? Are our spaces welcoming to everyone? Do we have all gender washrooms? In addition to anyone who might not identify with the gender binary, they're more friendly to families. Crayola renamed its flesh-colored crayons to peach many years ago, but what did the Band-Aids in our first aid kits look like? Do our washrooms have those sensor faucets that are known to be discriminatory toward people with darker skin tones? Do any of the kids who use our library go to schools that use a racist mascot? How can we be part of the fight against such overt racism? Is our library building named after a Confederate hero? Are there statues or artwork in our community celebrating settler colonialism? Are there other things that we see and wish they didn't represent us? We see a lot about call-out culture these days, and I definitely think it has its place, but I think sometimes there's an opportunity to call someone in, to talk to them personally and with care, and that's a way that we can be in good relation. Jay Smooth talks about having something racist stuck in your teeth. So how do we become good to each other to the level that we're comfortable with saying this, as well as receiving it when someone says it to us? If we hear a homophobic joke, can we ask the person telling it, why is that funny? If we see someone use the word tribe to mean just any old group of people, can we let them know that that undermines the sovereignty of Native nations? If someone uses a derogatory term, can we say, I'm sorry, I'm not sure I know what you mean by that. Could you explain that further? If we hear someone use the term spirit animal, can we suggest that they use the word patronus or another word that doesn't disrespect someone else's religious beliefs? If we see a racist interaction happening between patrons, can we step in and say, here at the library, we welcome all kinds of people and we look out for each other. What you said isn't okay. Can we, when we realize we said something, apologize immediately and out loud? Talking about these things is difficult, and sometimes it can just feel like it's too much. I don't even just want to deal with it. But I think that the violence that white supremacy inflicts vastly outweighs whatever discomfort or fatigue we might be feeling. We should build in self-care practices so that we can do this hard work, but we have to recognize that those who are being oppressed can't just take a break. So we need to rebuild our infrastructure to try to eliminate the systemic oppression that has been baked into our existing systems. We need to strive for full participation and shared power with diverse racial, cultural, and economic groups in determining our mission, structure, constituency, policies, and practices. If we're successful, members across all identity groups will be full participants in decisions that shape our institutions. If we're going to strive to provide excellent library service, we have to commit to continually learning and be okay with the fact that this work is difficult and probably only gets harder the further in we get. Our privilege is the biggest threat we can bring to anti-racism because it's so easy for us to make compromises that uphold white supremacy. But our privilege is also the most valuable thing that we can bring to anti-racism because it can do damage to white supremacy. We have access and our actions carry less risk. So miigwech, thank you. Here's that link to that source list and my contact info, and I would be delighted if anybody has any questions.
Thank you so much for that. So one question, I guess, would be, what suggestions would you have for dealing with microaggressions, whether you are the one who is receiving the microaggression or giving the microaggression, I guess?
Sure. So I think for me, I am rarely the person who is receiving it. You know, being a white lady, like it just does not, it doesn't come up directed at me very often, but I have definitely been in many situations where it was directed at someone else. And I feel like if I, you know, obviously all of this depends on the context and the relationship you have with the person who's being targeted with this microaggression, but I've had several occasions where I was able to say like, ooh, you know, that's messed up, or what did you mean, or something like that. And, you know, I'm not like stepping in to defend someone or whatever, but just calling out a thing for what it is. And like, it makes me feel gross too, even though if it's not directed at me. So that's something that I have found to be successful.
Thank you. Emily asked if any books or articles you have read have stood out to you that you would recommend to help us think about how we make assumptions or prejudices.
So this link leads you to a very long bibliography, and I apologize that it's so long, but I just have been collecting useful articles and you know, blog posts and other things for a while. I will say that lately I am finding podcasts to be especially helpful, and places where I find information that that I might not find elsewhere. There is a podcast called All My Relations, And it is two Indigenous women just talking about issues that are important in their lives. And, you know, like talking like big structural issues as well as like little everyday things. So that one I really love. And then there's another one that's called Yo, Is This Racist? And it is, again, two people talking, and they actually take calls from people. And then it's like people have like a minute to leave a little message, and often it will be a person who they know it is racist, whatever the situation is that they were in, but they want to hear the perspective of the hosts of the show. And they have a really good sense of humor, as you can tell by the title. And so those are just two things that I've found useful lately, but definitely plenty of things on this list, also more academic.
Perfect, thank you. And I think Emily might be typing another question too. So while we wait, this could be for both of you. What are some of the biggest challenges you face in your position?
For me, I would say a small budget and not enough time are my two biggest challenges. You know, libraries are typically always underfunded, and that's no different in a tribal library, possibly more so. But then I am responsible for 3 libraries, and they may be small, but I just never have enough time to do all the things that I would like to do or like to see happen for the community. So.
That makes total sense. And then Emily's other question is, have you talked with fellow librarians about this topic, and what have they said about assumptions and prejudices in libraries and possibly within their own work?
Well, I have given a version of this presentation, a longer version, at a conference that we had in Michigan that was called Small Libraries, Big Impact in the spring. And I was super worried about it because I thought, I'm gonna go in here and talk about white supremacy and people are gonna, you know, flip their lids and walk out or whatever, like no one's gonna wanna hear this. But it was it was a breakout session, so people could go to a different thing if they wanted to. But I had a really good response, and in fact had several other libraries, and then even like library industry company based in Michigan asked me to come to their staff and do this presentation, or a longer version of this. And so I do think that people are interested in hearing it. Like, I think that, to me, public library service anyway is always social justice work. And I think that a lot of people who work in libraries are interested in social justice and trying to make the world a better place. So I think that people are overall receptive, certainly not everyone. And, you know, I don't have any delusions that I'm going to change the world's minds or whatever of people who, you know, don't want to see every other human being as a human. But definitely I feel like I've been lucky enough to have a pretty positive response.
Good. And Christina asked, how would you recommend dealing with minority patrons who accuse staff of being racist, especially in situations where the patron is being intentionally antagonistic?
Gosh, I am not sure that I have a good answer for that. That is not something that I have encountered. I will give it thought, and if I come up with something, I will pass it along.
That'd be great, thank you. And then let's see, what other questions? What are your favorite parts of your position and what makes it all worth it? And both of you feel free to answer this question.
Jenice, do you want to jump in? I feel like I've been talking for ages.
That's totally okay. Can you repeat that question? I'm so sorry.
Yeah, no, you're fine. What are your favorite parts of your position and what makes it all worth it?
Well, my favorite part is working with a diverse, you know, with students who are diverse, learning styles that are diverse, parents that are, you know, are diverse. I think we all learn from each other, but I really like what Ian said about how far we have to come. You know, it's funny because there is some overlap there, because even in education, you have some disproportionality in special education, and discipline referrals to the office and stuff like that. So I think we have a long way to go, but I like the subject of talking about it. And to even kind of go back to when someone's being antagonistic, those are typically people I like to sit down and kind of talk about. And I think with education and kind of overcoming some of the stereotypes, you know, I feel like having the conversation out loud is helping us, if that makes sense. Again, still have a long way to go, but my favorite part is definitely the diversity in our schools and in our classrooms. Love that.
Awesome, thank you.
I think my favorite part about my job is, and I have, this is my 20th year in libraries as a professional. It's ridiculous. I feel so old when I say that, but, and I've worked in public libraries in small town and large suburban community outside Detroit, and then here in this tribal community. And I feel like the community is the part I like the best. You know, I serve a public library, an elementary school library, and a community college library, and I'm seeing the same families at all three of those, which is so amazing. You know, like I might see kids in their classes, and then I might see them come in after school, and then their families come in, their parents or whoever come in to get them, or their older brothers and sisters or their cousins. And then at the tribal college, many of the students are non-traditional, as at any community college. And, you know, so they're high school through elders taking classes at the college, and, you know, getting to really be a part of this community is just an honor for me. And also, because it is such a variety of tasks in my job, I get to do a lot of different things and feel like I'm, you know, I'm bringing in grant money to do cool projects that wouldn't happen otherwise or whatever. I get to make a difference in the community that doesn't rely on me being like center stage, but like being the facilitator or the behind the scenes person to make that stuff happen. That's very gratifying for me.
Okay. I know everything that you guys have talked about. I'm like, ooh, more opportunities for career paths. Emily is typing up another question for us. But I do have another one. What skills are most essential or valuable for working in your position?
I think probably, and can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And I don't want to speak for Anne, but I have a feeling this might be working with different individuals and being sensitive to that so that we can be in a position to listen and help and grow and overcome some of this. Would you agree, Anne?
I would. Definitely being flexible and self-reflective. You know, like I didn't learn about any of this stuff that I talked about when I went to library school. Like it's not a thing that we talked about out loud 20 years ago. And, you know, I feel lucky that I am in a field where we're figuring stuff out and being able to try and make a difference, even if it is through tiny things like not requiring a proof of address when giving out a library card or whatever, you know, that's good.
Makes sense. What advice would you give to someone who wants to do this kind of work?
That's a good question. I think you just have to have a passion for what you do. You know, if that just helps make even the bad days good. You know what I mean? It's because it gets you up in the morning and it's like I just love what I do. And I know that old saying, you know, if you love what you do, it's never work. I could not agree more. You know, and just kind of finding that passion, I think is really helpful.
I think that's very true in all of my library situations or jobs that I've had. Being passionate about the job is really what made it what it was for me. And I do think in tribal libraries specifically, like if you are like me, a white person, an outsider coming in, like recognizing that I'll never be the right person for this job, but I'm the person who's in it right now and I want to do my best and, you know, leave things better than they were when I came in somehow. I think that, you know, having good perspective, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
Perfect, thank you. And then I think this one's directed specifically at you, Jenice, from Emily. What advice can you give to public librarians who instruct patrons in programs or in other ways and utilize learning styles, but they are unfamiliar with the patron styles? Or in other words, what styles are the most popular that public librarians should use if they do not know what their patrons' learning styles are?
I think the first key is being aware of the different ones and having some sensitivity to it. Because I think as adults, sometimes if someone wants to come up and just ask us individual questions, sometimes that can be like, I just explained that to the whole group, or I just did a lesson on that, you know, over there. Kind of understanding that their learning style might be interpersonal, having the sensitivity, that if someone wants to walk around, it doesn't mean that they're not listening or they're not interested. So I think being aware of them is the first key, and having areas that can speak to any of them, as an area in the library where they can listen on headphones, an area where there's standing desks where they can stand, having comfortable chairs for someone that may want to lay down or read out loud, or an area where they can maybe talk and have quiet conversations for those that really need that or like that learning style. So I think just being sensitive and knowing that is a step in the right direction, because I think we need to get away from thinking that everybody's going to learn the same way or everybody's going to learn how I learn, because that's just not that's not where we're at anymore.
If you don't mind, Jenice, I'm going to pop in. I was a teacher for several years, and I work primarily with children. And one thing that I find really helpful, especially just because of the different developmental stages, when I'm doing a story time where I may have a 18-month-old and I may have a 4-year-old, on top of the different learning styles or possible disabilities, is I always start off by letting the patrons know that if they need to get up and move around, that's fine. If they need to take a break, that's fine. That it's totally normal for children to not be sitting still perfectly for a half hour listening to stories, and just kind of normalizing, letting patrons know that whatever they need is totally fine and allowable in a library, because a lot of people think that there's a very strict code of conduct for libraries, and a lot of times that code of conduct can be restrictive towards people with different needs.
I think you're absolutely correct, because then we kind of get into this pattern of and there's a lot of research behind it, and some people don't like this word, of shaming individuals, like, shh, this is where we're quiet, and for some people that's just not how they function. So I think being sensitive to that and kind of getting away from, like I said, kind of stereotyping that in this environment you do this, and I understand that you're not going to come into a library and have an all-out party. I understand that, but being sensitive to individual needs and not shaming that or kind of putting them in a corner for not conforming to you. It's kind of that old saying, which is also one of my favorites: if they don't learn how we teach, we need to teach how they learn. And so I think having that environment that would be friendly to that, or maybe a sensory area with some books in it for individuals with autism, I think we could maybe get more people. And I don't know, I could be speaking wrong, but we could have it more open and acceptable to have those individuals in our library systems.
I think that's absolutely right, Jenice. And I say those things even at the college where I am right now. People will come in and they'll be having a conversation. They'll be like, "Oh, I should be being quiet. I'm in the library." And I'm like, "Nope, you're fine. If you're shouting or something, I'll let you know." But this is a place where people come to work together as well as individually. So like, I use the term dull roar. Like it's, we don't need to be church mice or whatever.
Right, inside voices. And I think it's kind of overcoming even like you said, like having, bathrooms that are gender neutral. And it's just kind of changing with the times and getting away from those very old stereotypical views of like, in a library, this is where you're quiet, this is where you do this, this is where you do that. That's just not how we function as individuals.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys for all that wonderful feedback. I know I personally learned a lot. I hope that everybody else did as well. Emily said she thinks both of these presentations would be interesting to present to patrons as well.
I agree. The more people we can educate just across the board, the better.
Yeah. Does anybody have any last minute questions? I know I put a call out, but just in case, I want to capture anything. No worries.
You're fine, Emily.
All right, well, if anybody doesn't have any other questions, is there anything else that you guys would like to share before I end our session?
I would just say that if anybody wants to be in touch, please do. I love connecting with folks, and I know tribal libraries are not something that everybody's thinking about. So if there's anything that I can tell you about it or anything you want to learn or whatever, like I'm just happy to be in touch in whatever way works for y'all.
And I want to second that. Thank y'all for having me. This has been so much fun. And feel free to, any questions, even if it's not even about what we talked about or something, if you think I can help or be of assistance, please reach out. Just making connections would be great.
Thank you. Both of their contact information will be available on the blog, and I'll also put this recorded session on the blog as well, so you guys can go back to it and make any notes that you may have missed the first time around. So thank you both so much for your time. I really appreciate your presentations.
No problem. Thank you all so much. It was so nice being here.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Thanks.
Good
Good
for
night.
having me.
Thank you.
Bye, Ann.
Bye-bye. Mama Pete.